At a nationally televised press briefing in Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett, young, relentless, underestimated, faces off against Senate leader Chuck Schumer over explosive revelations about border policy. Before an audience of 42 journalists and millions watching online, she drops 17 pages of documents in a 3-year-old internal memo that turns Schumer's own words into political shrapnel. What began as a routine press event spirals into a high-stakes showdown between truth and power, past and present. The air thickens with tension, reputations tremble, and the room holds its breath. What did one congresswoman reveal that made America question everything it thought it knew? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the harsh lights of the Capitol Press Chamber, a press conference was underway, framed as a routine discussion on border security, but charged with unspoken tension. At the center of the storm stood Chuck Schumer, Majority Leader, a political titan with decades of trench warfare experience and a smirk that rarely left his face. And to his right, standing quietly, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, young, fierce, and unmistakably alone. The cameras weren't kind. They scanned her like a novelty, an outlier, a black progressive woman in a blue power suit, flanked by gray suits and tired smiles. Her presence wasn't welcomed. It was tolerated, barely. A staffer in the back chuckled under his breath. She's just here for optics. And as Schumer stepped to the podium, the room already decided who the real voice of authority would be. But Jasmine didn't blink, because this wasn't just another press conference. It was a battlefield. And Chuck Schumer had just fired the first shot. He shifted his weight at the podium like a man rehearsed in dominance, smoothing the edge of his jacket while scanning the room with that signature, knowing smile. Then he struck, with a voice dipped in disdain. "We've got enough chaos at the border," he began, voice tinged with faux urgency. "We don't need more chaos from microphones reading off talking points." "Let's be honest," he said, tilting his head ever so slightly. "Some of us here today aren't offering substance. They're just playing back the same old recording." The words slithered out slowly, every syllable intentional. A few microphones in this room are stuck on loop, reciting activist slogans dressed up as policy, mimicking progress while parroting chaos. Then came the pause. His gaze slid toward Jasmine like a spotlight sweeping across a stage, and though he didn't name her, the silence he left behind did. Reporters' heads turned. A few chuckled, some raised eyebrows, and at least one camera crew zoomed in on Jasmine's face, waiting, hoping for a crack in her expression. Schumer continued, "If leadership could be downloaded and played back, maybe we'd be making progress by now." Another laugh, this one colder, sharper. In less than 30 seconds, he had painted Jasmine not as a representative, not even as an adversary, but as a malfunctioning speaker, programmed, replaceable, and irrelevant. And yet she stood there, unmoving, unshaken, not out of pride, but because she recognized the ritual for what it was, the oldest move in the book. Not just to discredit, but to dehumanize. To reduce a woman, young, black, and fiercely intelligent, to a stereotype so thin it wouldn't survive a second of real scrutiny. What made it worse wasn't the insult itself. It was the applause behind it. The way some reporters leaned back, entertained. The way the smirks in the back row whispered more than any quote. Jasmine wasn't just being dismissed, she was being made an example of. And the cruelty wasn't accidental. It was strategic. He could have disagreed with her ideas, challenged her numbers, questioned her plans, but instead he chose the one attack that couldn't be rebutted with a chart. Erasure disguised as wit. Her skin, her age, her defiance, all weaponized against her in a moment designed to humiliate without ever sounding harsh. It was political theater, and Jasmine had just been cast, without consent, as the disposable extra. But Schumer made one mistake. He assumed this scene would end the way it always did, with silence. What he didn't know was that Jasmine wasn't here to read a script. She was here to shred one. What Schumer didn't realize was that the silence he mistook for submission wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't scoff, didn't so much as blink under the weight of that patronizing insult. Instead, she locked eyes with him, unwavering, focused, still as a blade drawn, but not yet swung. Every muscle in her face was calm, composed, but beneath the surface pulsed the cold, methodical rhythm of someone who had seen this coming from a mile away. She had anticipated the dig, predicted the exact tone, even the smirk. For weeks, she had replayed scenarios like this in her mind, playing them forward and backward, memorizing every possible angle he might strike from. While Schumer was polishing his press lines and trading smiles with anchors, Jasmine was poring over transcripts, cross-referencing internal memos, pulling archived speeches from C-SPAN at 2 in the morning. Her kitchen table had become a war room, her walls a battlefield of sticky notes and timelines. This wasn't improvisation, this was strategy. And today wasn't a response. It was an ambush, perfectly timed. The injustice wasn't new, it was just more public now. Jasmine knew exactly what game was being played. A powerful man mocking a young black woman on live television wasn't some offhand misstep. It was a message, a warning to others like her. Know your place. But Jasmine had never accepted the role they'd written for her. She'd grown up seeing what happened to women who spoke too directly, who showed up too prepared. They were labeled aggressive, ungrateful, unqualified. But if this town ran on fear, she had chosen early on to be immune. So while Schumer leaned back, confident he'd just neutralized her with a laugh line, Jasmine was already flipping through the exact page she'd marked 3 nights ago, the one with his signature, his contradiction, his hypocrisy, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate the truth. Because sometimes silence wasn't surrender. Sometimes it was the last breath before fire. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match insult with insult. She simply opened the folder. The folder didn't just open, it unfolded like a loaded weapon. Every page inside had been hand-selected, cross-checked, and annotated in the margin with midnight ink and months of exhaustion. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She let the silence sit like fog after a detonation. Thick, anticipatory, eerie. Then with both hands steady, she lifted a single page and laid it flat across the podium, like evidence in a federal trial. The paper was clean but worn at the corners, highlighted in orange, time-stamped at the bottom, and bearing the unmistakable ink of a Senate seal. She looked up slowly, her voice cutting through the tension like a surgical blade. In 2009, Senator Schumer declared, and I quote, "Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple." There was no emphasis, no dramatization, just his words exact and unaltered. The phrase echoed in the room like a gunshot in a cathedral. Phones that had been casually lifted now paused midair. Reporters froze, caught in the act of dismissal. You could see it the moment their posture changed. A few lifted their heads. One even whispered, "Wait, what?" to a colleague nearby. Jasmine didn't blink. She held up the paper between her fingers, steady as stone, the highlighted section glowing under the camera lights. At the bottom, plain as day, Charles E. Schumer, U.S. Senate, Georgetown Forum, 2009. His signature, familiar, arrogant, and legally binding, stared back at them from beneath the quote. She didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She just let the room sit in the weight of what had been unearthed. This wasn't a gotcha moment. It was a reckoning. Jasmine knew exactly what this page represented. Not just a contradiction, but a betrayal. For years, Schumer had painted her as inexperienced, as a naive voice shouting into the wind of adult politics. But today, the imbalance cracked. Because the truth she held in her hand wasn't opinion, it was history, and it bore his name. In that instant, the decades of power behind Schumer's smirk began to flicker. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The mocking glint in his eye faltered. The press saw it. Jasmine saw it. And for the first time all morning, he knew. She hadn't come to react. She had come to reverse the narrative. And just when the room began to recover from the first blow, Jasmine turned the page, and the entire atmosphere shifted again, like the air thinning before a second explosion. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her composure was lethal enough. "Now," she said, her tone sharpening, Let's talk about policy, not rhetoric. She held up a second document, thicker, stamped, official, its corners dog-eared from use, its contents already memorized word for word. This is a 2018 internal policy proposal drafted by Senator Schumer's own office. It outlines three key objectives: the construction of reinforced physical barriers at high-traffic border sectors, expedited removal processes for undocumented entrants, and bilateral cooperation with Mexico to manage asylum processing before individuals reach the U.S. She let the words hang there, deliberately. "Sound familiar?" she added, glancing toward the cameras. Reporters were now flipping through their own notes. One even mouthed, "That's exactly what the current administration is doing." But Jasmine wasn't finished, not even close. Senator Schumer has spent the last year calling those same policies xenophobic, cruel, and extremist, she said. And yet, here they are, his words, his proposals, his signature. The injustice hit like a punch to the gut, one not just aimed at her, but at every citizen manipulated by the illusion of moral high ground. Jasmine didn't merely expose a contradiction, she dismantled an entire political facade in real time. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle, it was glaring, documented, deliberate. Schumer had condemned others for implementing a border strategy he himself once authored. And now, in front of dozens of journalists and millions watching, he stood silent while she peeled away the layers. Her hands didn't tremble. Her gaze never dropped. "If a wall is inhumane now," she said with icy precision, "then it was inhumane when you proposed it. If enforcement is cruel now, it was cruel when you endorsed it. Unless, of course, cruelty is defined not by content, but by who gets the credit." The room was no longer listening out of politeness. It was bracing for impact. And just when it seemed the line between exposure and collapse had already been crossed, Jasmine reached back into her folder, not with haste, but with the slow, deliberate gravity of someone about to detonate the final charge beneath a crumbling wall. She pulled out a thick document, stapled at the corner, lined with redacted names and timestamps, its top page marked with the unmistakable seal of the Department of Homeland Security. She didn't need to explain its weight. She let the silence do it for her. "What I'm holding now," she began, voice steady as stone, "is a verbatim transcript from a closed-door meeting held last April between Senator Schumer and Democratic governors from key border states." Heads lifted. Some mouths parted in disbelief. Every camera in the room pivoted toward her with a speed that felt almost involuntary. "In that meeting," she continued, "the senator acknowledged the exact quote, 'The situation at the border requires tough measures, even if they're politically hard to swallow.'" The words weren't interpreted or paraphrased. They were exact, delivered with the kind of precision that buries denial before it can be spoken. She didn't lean forward. She didn't raise her tone. She simply let the raw contradiction speak for itself, her fingers resting gently on the corner of the document, as if daring anyone to challenge its authenticity. That sentence was not whispered. It was recorded, transcribed, and logged as part of the Department of Homeland Security's Intergovernmental Coordination Protocol. Jasmine paused, long enough for the weight of that statement to land in the chest of every person in the room. "And before anyone claims fabrication," she said, lifting a separate page with methodical clarity, "this transcript was obtained legally through a Freedom of Information Act request, filed 3 months ago, approved 2 weeks later, and verified by 2 independent legal analysts." In that moment, the injustice she had carried alone for weeks became undeniable. A man who publicly smeared policy as cruel had privately admitted its necessity, and done so with full awareness that the public would never hear it. The sentence, "The situation at the border requires tough measures, even if they're politically hard to swallow," wasn't just a quote, it was a confession. And Jasmine didn't just reveal it, she forced the nation to read it. The moment Jasmine finished speaking, the stillness in the room turned electric. No longer the quiet of disbelief, but the coiled tension of a fuse already burning. And this time the explosion wasn't hers. All it took was a single breath before the first question cracked through the chamber like a warning shot. Senator Schumer, a correspondent from the National Ledger, called out, her voice cutting through the air with surgical precision. Do you deny that you made those remarks to the governors? Schumer flinched, not with his body, but in his breath, caught mid-adjustment of his tie, his confidence now unraveling thread by thread. Before he could answer, a second voice shot forward, louder, angrier. Why would you call policies inhumane in public if you privately support them behind closed doors? The question wasn't merely curious, it was accusatory, deliberate. Then it came. The third reporter didn't raise a hand. He didn't wait to be called on. His voice rose from the center aisle with the bluntness of a verdict. Senator, are you misleading voters to score political points? Is this just a game to you? The words didn't land like questions. They landed like charges, leveled with the weight of betrayal. Flashbulbs strobed as journalists turned in unison toward the man who had, just moments ago, stood unchallenged. The power imbalance that had defined the morning had flipped with terrifying speed. Jasmine had said nothing during the barrage. She didn't need to. Her silence was now the loudest voice in the room. The very reporters who had once overlooked her were now demanding accountability from the man who had mocked her. And in their eyes, Schumer wasn't a leader anymore. He was a man caught between two truths, the one he had lived in public and the one Jasmine had forced him to face in front of the nation. And as the barrage of questions reached a boiling point, Schumer finally moved, not with the gravitas of a statesman reclaiming order, but with the urgency of a man scrambling to plug a breach he never saw coming. He stepped back toward the microphone, lips pressed tight, one hand gripping the podium like it was the last solid thing in a collapsing world. The lights above caught the faint sheen of sweat collecting along his brow. For a brief second, he seemed to summon the old tone, that practiced, polished cadence honed over decades of press briefings and Senate debates. These materials, he said, voice low and deliberate, have been taken completely out of context. He let the words hang, but they didn't land. No one nodded. No one blinked. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Selective quoting, he continued, is not the same as transparency. We all know how these things can be manipulated when you don't have the full picture, but the tone was off. It wasn't conviction. It was containment. And Jasmine knew it. She didn't interrupt. She waited. Then she turned, slowly, deliberately, to face him, her binder already in hand, thick and unmistakably intact. The contrast between them was stark. He gripped words like a defense. She held truth like a blade. Her voice, when it came, was clear, unflinching, and devastating in its calm. I brought the full documents, Senator. Complete, unaltered, and time-stamped. The press is welcome to verify every word. That was not a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. There was no flourish, no raised volume. Only the certainty of someone who had prepared not for applause but for impact. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. The room had shifted. The burden of proof now rested on the shoulders of the man who had just tried to dismiss her as careless with context. And in the silence that followed, the press knew exactly what had just happened. A torch had changed hands, and it was burning a hole straight through the mask of authority. And just as the last vestiges of Schumer's denial dissolved beneath the weight of her full, unaltered documentation, Jasmine reached for a single sheet, one that had been sealed in its own sleeve, separate from the rest, as if even paper had to respect its gravity. She didn't hold it up theatrically. She didn't need to. Its weight came not from spectacle, but from substance. With a motion so measured it felt ritualistic, Jasmine unfolded the page and placed it flat against the podium, pressing it down with both hands before speaking. Her voice dropped lower now, not out of weariness, but precision, like a scalpel being steadied for its final incision. This, she said, pausing just long enough for the tension to throb in the walls, is an internal email, dated July 14th of last year, sent from Senator Schumer's office directly to Governor Kristi Noem. A few reporters leaned forward unconsciously. Others froze, their pens suspended in midair. Jasmine looked down at the line once more, then spoke it slowly, with the clarity of someone handing over a confession signed in daylight. Let's attack the current administration on messaging, while we quietly implement similar measures. The words landed with no echo, only silence, deep, guttural, and absolute. It wasn't the kind of silence that begged explanation. It was the kind that demanded accountability. Every camera in the room rotated toward her like steel to magnet, the shift mechanical, almost reverent. She didn't blink. She didn't even look at Schumer. There was no need. The room had turned. The press knew what they were hearing was not just political contradiction. It was calculated deception, written in ink, archived, and exposed under fluorescent lights for the world to witness. Jasmine had not accused. She had demonstrated. And as the weight of those 15 words crushed the last defenses around the man who had mocked her, the imbalance of the morning reversed itself with a quiet, brutal elegance. The injustice was now not just theoretical, it was documented, time-stamped, undeniable. And Jasmine Crockett, once written off as a mere voice in the crowd, now stood as the architect of the silence that swallowed the room. And as the final word left Jasmine's lips, "The press is welcome to verify every word," the silence that followed wasn't just stillness, it was surrender. Chuck Schumer stood motionless for a beat too long, as if hoping that sheer presence could reassert the dominance he'd lost. But dominance requires ground, and Jasmine had taken every inch of it. Without a word, he turned from the podium, his shoes echoing sharply across the stone floor. His aides flanked him instantly, murmuring damage control strategies already too late to matter. One placed a phone in his hand, the screen already alive with calls from comms directors and legal advisors. He didn't say a word. He didn't look back. The man who had arrived smiling, mocking, commanding, vanished behind a curtain mid-call, clutching his phone like a lifeline, swallowed by his own retreat. And Jasmine? She didn't pause. She didn't watch him go. She simply reached for the next packet of documents and placed it on the press table with the precision of someone setting a cornerstone. "Every outlet will receive copies," she said, her voice sharp and composed. "If you have additional questions, I'll be here." The reporters didn't argue. They didn't scoff or smirk or glance around for Schumer's rebuttal, because there wasn't one. The shift in power was complete. Cameras that had once panned past her now remained fixed. Voices that had doubted her now lined up to ask the next question. She answered each one directly. No spin, no flourish, just facts sharpened by days of brutal preparation. The injustice she had walked into, the casual erasure, the condescension masked as banter, had been shattered in real time. And when the headlines hit the wire an hour later, they weren't about Chuck Schumer's press briefing. They were about the woman who made him walk out of his own. The walkout was not the end. It was the ignition. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped away from the podium, her documents fully distributed and her voice still echoing in the press chamber's high ceilings, the story had already escaped the Capitol and begun carving a path through the media bloodstream. Phones in the room lit up like a cascade of fireflies. Notifications from editors, producers, newsroom directors shouting across digital lines, "Get it live. Get it now." Reporters no longer wrote to meet deadlines. They wrote to outrun each other. And within 20 minutes of Schumer's silent exit, the nation's most powerful media engines had seized upon the reckoning that had just unfolded. Headlines didn't just report what happened. They distilled it into fire. Fox News broke first. Schumer unmasked by Crockett. A 6-word gut punch stretched across the lower third of the broadcast, the chyron bleeding red beneath split-screen footage of Schumer's retreat and Jasmine's unflinching delivery. The network replayed the footage on loop, the quote about attacking the current administration on messaging, the full binders, the walkout. Their commentators, often locked in predictable rhythms, now sat stunned, nodding slowly. "You can disagree with her politics," one anchor admitted, but that was a masterclass in dismantling institutional hypocrisy. They called her poised, methodical, and devastating. It wasn't a partisan celebration. It was a reluctant salute to the magnitude of what had occurred. Then came CNN, more measured, but no less shaken. Their headline was clinical, surgical. Document trail raises tough questions for Senate leader. But beneath the calm surface, the urgency pulsed like a buried wire. The network interrupted scheduled programming with a special panel segment, each analyst flipping through printed screenshots of the email to Kristi Noem and the 2018 policy memo Jasmine had read aloud. "We have confirmation this was obtained through FOIA," one senior correspondent noted, tapping the corner of the packet with her pen. "This isn't speculation. This is hard paper." Another panelist added with barely concealed alarm, "We're not talking about evolving policy stances. We're talking about a strategic, deliberate public-private split in messaging." The discussion turned clinical, then damning. One historian likened it to a Nixon moment in miniature. Not criminal, but corrosive. Trust-breaking. Measured in damage not by law, but by legacy. And then MSNBC, which had, just that morning, run a segment framing Schumer as a steady hand on immigration policy, cut to black and returned with a stark title card. Reckoning within Democratic Party? The question mark did little to soften the blow. The tone was suddenly introspective. The commentary edged with unease. "What we're seeing here," said one senior anchor, "isn't just a tactical embarrassment. It's a values crisis. If we're going to call out misinformation and moral cowardice on one side of the aisle, we have to confront it on our own when it stares us in the face." They ran the footage of Jasmine's quiet stare as she delivered the full quote, "Let's attack the current administration on messaging while we quietly implement similar measures." The silence after that line was allowed to linger. Not filled, not explained, just held, like a mirror the network itself wasn't ready to look into. Across social media, the headlines were already being clipped, cropped, and quoted into virality. Hashtags surge, shocking Crockett drops receipts, shocking Schumer walks, shocking truth over spin. Users across the spectrum, journalists, veterans, college students, even former aides, began stitching side-by-side comparisons of Schumer's public statements and Jasmine's receipts. TikTok accounts narrated her every word like courtroom drama. Twitter was a firestorm of screen grabs and stunned responses. She brought facts like a prosecutor. That wasn't a press conference. That was a political dissection. You just witnessed power shift in real time. Even on platforms typically resistant to acknowledging progressive voices, there was a kind of stunned respect, not because of who she was, but because of what she did. And for Jasmine, it was never about going viral. It was about proving the truth had a pulse and could still outlive a lie. She didn't demand the headlines. She earned them. Line by line, page by page, through the kind of sleepless research that doesn't win headlines until it cracks one open. She had walked into that briefing as the youngest person in the room, facing a wall of cameras angled to overlook her. By the time she stepped down, those same cameras chased her like they were hunting history. The injustice she walked in with, the double standard, the condescension, the quiet calculation that a woman like her could be framed, mocked, and ignored, was now reversed on live television. Chuck Schumer hadn't just lost a debate. He'd lost narrative control, the one currency Capitol veterans guard like oxygen. And Jasmine Crockett, once framed as a mouthpiece for someone else's agenda, had just written her own chapter in bold, irreversible ink. By sunset, op-eds were already being drafted, staffers in Senate offices were briefing against panic, and press secretaries were scrambling to review everything their bosses had ever put in writing. But one thing was already set in stone. Jasmine hadn't just exposed Schumer. She had redefined what exposure looked like in a world drowning in spin. The cameras would move on. The cycle would refresh. But that headline, "Schumer Unmasked by Crockett," would live longer than the smirk he walked in with. And as the headlines thundered across the nation, "Schumer Unmasked," document trail erupts, Crockett's receipts shift narrative. The aftershocks began to ripple through a press corps that, just hours earlier, had written her off. She didn't walk out of the press room like a victor. She walked out like someone who had just finished surgery with no margin for error. Her face was calm, but her hands, still gripping the final folder, showed the weight of what she had just done. The injustice she had carried into that briefing, the sneers, the dismissive questions, the subtle jokes about her age, her background, her voice, hadn't disappeared. But now they had been flipped and frozen, exposed under the same lights that once tried to erase her. That erasure was no longer possible. Journalists who had barely looked up from their phones when she first stepped to the podium were now lining up outside her office door. Emails flooded in from anchors who, just a week before, had treated her like filler between more serious guests. They weren't offering softball segments. They were begging for exclusives. NBC wanted a sit-down for Meet the Press. CNN asked for a primetime segment with their chief political analyst. Even the New York Times, which hadn't run a single feature on her since she entered Congress, sent a photographer and a writer the same afternoon. But what stood out more than the invitations was who they were coming from. These were the very names who had dismissed her as a performer, a soundbite machine, a MAGA antagonist. Now their emails were filled with praise. Your composure was masterful. We'd love to hear your side in full. You've shifted the conversation. The hypocrisy would have been laughable if it hadn't been so predictable. And Jasmine saw it for exactly what it was. She didn't soften because the tide turned. She didn't gloat or pose. She answered with the same fire-forged precision that had burned down the scaffolding around Schumer's performance. I'll do interviews, she told her team bluntly, but only with the full documents in hand. No spin, no edits. She wasn't interested in headlines. She was interested in truth, the kind that doesn't make for neat sound bites, but leaves a scar. Because she remembered the snickers in the back of the room, the way one producer asked her staff, is she just going to rant again? The way a columnist had called her an echo with good hair. These same voices now called her a force, a truth teller, a reckoning with a binder full of facts. That wasn't just irony, it was vindication. And Jasmine didn't let it soften her edge. It sharpened it. She moved through the next 24 hours like a general securing ground after battle. Every interview she accepted was met with conditions. Full airing of her source documents, no framing without verification, no selective cutting. When MSNBC's booking team asked if she'd like makeup and lighting prep, her response was curt. Just turn the camera on. I didn't win this by looking pretty. And in each appearance, she didn't just rehash what happened, she layered it, deepened it, made it undeniable. She explained how the memo had been buried beneath 3 other legislative drafts, how the FOIA request had been delayed twice before approval, how the internal staffer who leaked the email to her wasn't partisan, just exhausted by double standards. She named the dates, the emails, the timestamps. She brought the receipts again and again. What began as a scandal for Schumer was becoming something more dangerous for the establishment, a pattern. And Jasmine wasn't just exposing it. She was dragging it into daylight where no headline could bury it. Behind the scenes, her staff barely kept up. 2 interns worked overnight compiling media kits. Her chief of staff fielded over 90 booking requests in less than 18 hours. But none of it rattled her. Jasmine had been waiting for this moment, not for glory, not for revenge, but for the truth to finally matter more than spin. And as she sat across from anchors who used to cut her mid-sentence, she didn't flinch when they asked loaded questions. She turned the table every time, with documentation, with facts, with fire that didn't flicker. I'm not here to be liked, she said during a PBS NewsHour segment. I'm here to make sure the next time someone calls a woman like me a puppet, they remember what happened the last time. The host blinked, silent for a moment, before responding. Congresswoman, that may be the quote of the year. But Jasmine didn't smile. She just picked up the next question and kept going. But while the media storm raged and Jasmine answered interview after interview with relentless clarity, something quieter, more insidious, was happening behind the closed mahogany doors of Capitol Hill. The halls that had once echoed with polite indifference toward her presence now pulsed with a different energy, fear wrapped in admiration. Jasmine could feel it in the way people looked at her. Longer, more calculating. No longer invisible, but no more embraced either. She wasn't being congratulated with handshakes and cameras. She was being studied. And then, as the headlines persisted and the smoke refused to clear from Schumer's camp, the whispers began to walk on 2 legs. That same afternoon, 3 Democratic lawmakers who hadn't so much as nodded her way in months casually wandered by her office, separately staggered, like shadows trying not to overlap. Each stopped briefly, asked about scheduling, or pretended to be in the wrong hallway before finally leaning in with the same exact message. We know you were right. We just can't say that on television. The words were murmured like contraband, not shouted, not even whispered with pride, just slipped through clenched teeth like the air from a tire slowly losing pressure. These were not allies. They were observers, people who had watched a political reality detonate in real time and were now terrified that the same fire might one day burn toward their corner of the chamber. They didn't thank her. They didn't offer help. They only offered quiet, cowed validation, as if she was carrying a truth they all shared but refused to hold. And that was the injustice Jasmine had always known was there, but had never seen so nakedly exposed. That truth in Washington wasn't silenced by lies. It was starved by cowardice. And it didn't stop there. The next day, after a committee hearing that felt more tense than usual, Jasmine returned to her office to find her staff unusually quiet. One of her interns, eyes wide, pointed silently to her desk. Sitting atop a stack of security briefings and media summaries was a single folded note card, left unsealed. No name, no letterhead, just her name, handwritten on the front in blocky, deliberate pen. She opened it slowly, half expecting sarcasm, half expecting a threat. But inside there were only 3 words. Don't stop now. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but the paper was Senate stationery, thick, off-white, reserved for internal memoranda. And that told her everything she needed to know. It came from the inside, from someone who knew exactly what line had just been crossed and wasn't ready to cross it themselves. Jasmine stared at the card for a long time, her thumb brushing the edge like it might disappear if she blinked. It didn't, and neither did the message. That moment, more than the headlines, more than the walkout, more than the cameras, cut the deepest, because it confirmed what she had feared all along, that she wasn't the only one who saw the rot. She was just the only one who dared to name it out loud. The note wasn't encouragement, it was confession, and with it came a weight heavier than any insult Schumer had thrown at her that morning. She didn't share the message with the press. She didn't tell her staff. She just slid the card into the back of her binder, filed next to the memo, the email, the transcript, and locked the drawer. Because the battlefield wasn't just on live TV anymore. It was in the whispers, in the note cards, in the silence of those too afraid to speak. And Jasmine Crockett had already decided she would never be one of them. And as the note tucked quietly into her binder whispered, "Don't stop now," Jasmine didn't. But something else had already started. Something no memo, no committee, no inner circle strategist could stop. The internet caught fire. Not the kind of fire that fizzles in an hour. This was a full-blown ignition. The moment she walked out of the Capitol press room, her footage detonated across the digital battlefield like a chain of perfectly timed explosions. The first clip, 34 seconds long, was posted by a local Hill staffer with less than 200 followers. It showed Jasmine lifting the internal memo, eyes calm, hands steady, voice lethal. Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple. No edits, no overlays, just raw truth in real time. In under 15 minutes, it was retweeted by a national political strategist. In 30, it hit 1 million views. In 1 hour, it was on the homepage of Twitter. But that was just the beginning. TikTok, always 5 steps ahead of the media machine, took it next. Within an hour, Gen Z creators had taken the footage and set it to cinematic music. Bass-heavy, heart-thumping tracks that matched the rhythm of her delivery like a thriller trailer. One of the most viral clips cut between her calm voice and the stunned silence in the room as Schumer's posture shifted from smug to cornered. A bold caption flashed across the screen. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the room's blood pressure. YouTube wasn't far behind. A prominent political reaction channel uploaded a side-by-side breakdown. Jasmine on the left, Schumer on the right, the screen split between clarity and collapse. The host, known more for sarcasm than reverence, sat in silence for 30 seconds before saying, "Okay, that's not politics, that's surgical." His video trended at number 3 globally within 5 hours. Then came the thumbnails. Titles like, "The Moment Everything Changed," and "Jasmine Crockett Brings the House Down with Just One Folder," flooded the algorithm. Each was a fragment of a larger reckoning, and every frame carried Jasmine's voice like a battle cry wrapped in evidence. But what turned the ripple into a wave wasn't just the views. It was who was watching: veterans, teachers, small-town mechanics, Black grandmothers in Georgia, disillusioned Democrats in Ohio, Gen Z organizers in Brooklyn. Even centrists who'd tuned out of politics entirely found themselves watching her clips on loop, not because of outrage, but because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. A young black congresswoman standing unshaken beneath the scrutiny of national media, dismantling a Senate titan not with aggression, but with facts, line by line, memo by memo, binder by binder. A retired Army colonel from Texas, wearing his service cap and trembling slightly as he filmed, posted to Facebook, "I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. That woman stood in a lion's den and didn't flinch. I've led men into combat who didn't keep their nerves like that." His post was shared 47,000 times in 3 hours. One comment read, "She walked into a rigged room and made the system blink first." On Reddit, the front page turned into a live forensic breakdown of every document she'd presented. Users pulled old C-SPAN clips, cross-referenced timestamps, and tracked down every public contradiction between Schumer's past speeches and Jasmine's folder. They weren't just watching, they were investigating alongside her. One viral thread, titled "She Did Their Job for Them," cataloged 12 direct contradictions with sources, links, and dates. It was upvoted 98,000 times. The top comment read, "This is what it looks like when someone prepares like their career doesn't belong to the system, but to the truth." On Instagram, stylized photos of Jasmine's most powerful moments began circulating. Her hand on the binder, her eyes locked on Schumer, her expression as calm as a surgeon's before a first incision. Artists turned her into digital murals. Graphic designers turned her, quote, "The press is welcome to verify every word," into t-shirts overnight. One black and white sketch showed Jasmine holding up a document while the shadows behind her morphed into broken pillars labeled "spin," "double standards," and "old guard." The caption below simply read, "Truth has no age limit." Even Jasmine's critics, those who had publicly ridiculed her, dismissed her as performative, accused her of just being loud, began to reverse course. A longtime columnist from a conservative outlet who had once called her a microphone without message, posted a retraction thread that stunned even his own followers. "I underestimated Jasmine Crockett," he wrote. "I didn't see a strategy because I didn't expect her to have one. That's not on her. That's on me. She didn't just come prepared. She came to expose how little everyone else was." His tweets were retweeted by veterans of both parties, and for once the replies weren't sarcastic. They were grateful. The emotional force of the moment wasn't just in Jasmine's facts. It was in the recognition that she had done what most wouldn't dare, told the truth in a room built to punish it. She hadn't shouted over anyone. She hadn't postured. She simply refused to yield. And the world watched her turn every quiet dismissal she'd ever faced into a crescendo of validation. One of the most widely shared comments came from a woman who'd once organized against Jasmine in a primary challenge. "I didn't vote for her. I didn't believe in her. But I just watched that woman dismantle 40 years of political theater with a folder and her voice. That's not a politician. That's a force of nature." And still, Jasmine never looked at the numbers. She never checked the trending tags. While her staff refreshed alerts and forwarded headlines, she remained focused, speaking only when needed, sharpening her next set of notes with the same discipline that had carried her through the first fight. Because the injustice wasn't over, it had just been peeled back. And maybe that was what shook the system more than anything. She didn't ask for applause. She asked for accountability, and the internet had delivered it in full. One final clip, shared by an account with just 200 followers, captured the quiet moment as she walked out of the press room, the doors closing behind her, her face not triumphant, but focused, holding the same binder, the same poise, the same silence she'd carried into the fire. It was captioned simply, "She didn't walk out like a hero. She walked out like someone who's not done." And America agreed. And as the digital wildfire cooled into a simmering national reflection, one truth lingered louder than any headline. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just flipped the narrative. She'd forced Washington to look in the mirror. 7 days later, that mirror moved from the internet to the halls of power. Capitol Hill, still bruised from the public reckoning, began shifting in quiet, uncomfortable ways. The usual backslapping confidence of immigration subcommittee members was gone, replaced by stiffer suits, fewer jokes, and an undertone of calculation behind every syllable. The press was watching now. More importantly, the people were. And so, when the Federal Oversight Committee convened its latest round of hearings on immigration reform, a topic long buried beneath talking points and partisan echo chambers, there was something different on the agenda. Her name, Jasmine Crockett, had been officially requested as the opening voice for the first joint hearing on bipartisan immigration policy in over a decade. Not as a witness, not as a footnote, as the leadoff speaker. The chair's gavel hadn't even dropped when whispers began circling the chamber. Is she really opening? Who approved this? She's junior. She's not supposed to get that seat. But she had it. And when the hearing room doors opened to the public that morning, a line wrapped halfway down the Capitol's South Corridor. Journalists, Hill staffers, everyday citizens who'd taken time off work just to watch what they knew wasn't just a hearing. It was history rewriting itself in real time. Inside, the atmosphere felt more like a courtroom than a committee session. The long mahogany dais stretched out before her, lined with senators and representatives who'd once considered her a political rookie. She was the only woman at the table, the only black representative in that chamber. And by every unspoken rule of Washington hierarchy, she wasn't supposed to be sitting where she was. But here she was, not as an exception, but as the example. And they all knew it. She wore midnight blue, no brooch, no flourish. Just the same calm armor she had worn when she dismantled Schumer's narrative, with a folder and her voice. In front of her sat a meticulously prepared binder, tabs, flags, executive summaries, all color-coded by subcategory: border infrastructure, asylum processing, internal contradictions in federal enforcement testimony. She didn't fidget. She didn't adjust her microphone. She sat in perfect stillness until the gavel came down. "The committee will come to order," the chairman announced, his voice steady, but his eyes flicking toward her more often than necessary. Jasmine leaned forward, not with ceremony, with conviction. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice low, measured and broadcast live on C-SPAN, YouTube, and dozens of independent platforms that had chosen to stream her appearance without commercial interruption. "We are not here today because our policies are working. We are here because they are collapsing under the weight of contradiction." The first slide went up behind her, a side-by-side comparison of border policies proposed in 2018 and those condemned in 2024. Her cursor circled identical phrases: enhanced removal proceedings, physical deterrence in high-traffic sectors, cross-agency cooperation for expedited asylum review. She looked up, and every member on the dais looked back, silent. "Some in this room," she continued, "have labeled these measures inhumane until they quietly signed them into their own subcommittee proposals. My question today isn't who changed their mind. My question is, why was the truth only safe in private?" Gaffes didn't echo, but they rippled. A senator who had publicly rebuked her 6 months ago leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping his binder without rhythm. Another whispered to an aide, but none interrupted, because they couldn't. She wasn't there to speculate. She was there to document. Every claim backed by a page, every accusation grounded in policy, every contradiction tied to a name and a vote. She walked through emails, archived speeches, FOIA, extracted call summaries. It wasn't performance. It was prosecution. And what made it devastating wasn't her volume. It was her silence. She didn't rush. She let the gaps breathe. She gave every document time to sink in. One journalist later wrote, "Watching Jasmine Crockett lead that hearing was like watching someone perform open-heart surgery in a glass room, with the world watching and no space for error." And that's exactly how it felt. The injustice was still there, in the side glances, in the too polite handoffs, in the way some lawmakers tried to frame her precision as passion or narrative control. But she saw through it. She lived in that space long enough to know when respect was earned versus when it was begrudgingly given under the weight of public pressure. She didn't crave it. She didn't need it. What she needed was for the record to reflect the truth. And on that day, it did. At the end of her remarks, she didn't pause for applause. She simply said, "I yield back," and sat down, like a mountain returning to stillness. The hearing continued, but the temperature had changed. No one dared recycle talking points without first checking their citations. Even longtime members known for grandstanding chose their words with surgeon-like care. And outside that chamber, the headlines began rolling again. But this time, they didn't focus on spectacle. They focused on substance. And at the center of it all sat a young woman who was never supposed to lead the room. But now no one else could. The week had already split the political axis wide open. But it was Saturday night's CNN segment, usually the slowest hour in the news cycle, that detonated the aftershock. The studio was quiet, stage lights dimmed to a smoldering glow, like a courtroom seconds before a verdict. On screen, Jasmine Crockett's image lingered in silence for 3 beats, her eyes steady, her voice stilled mid-sentence, a freeze frame of defiance. Then the host, seasoned and composed, turned toward the camera and spoke the words that would travel farther than anyone expected. "Let's make one thing clear," she said, eyes locking into the lens like she was speaking to a nation leaning over its dinner plate. "This moment wasn't about youth. It wasn't about race. It wasn't even about party loyalty. This was about truth, about courage, about what it means to walk into a system built to erase you and leave a scar that forces it to blink." The screen split in two. On the left, Jasmine lifting a sealed folder, pages clipped and lined with color-coded tabs. On the right, Chuck Schumer, turning away from a microphone, jaw locked, gaze unfocused. The contrast was surgical. This wasn't just another news report. It was an autopsy. The host continued, now leaning forward, hands clasped with the weight of what she was about to say. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't grandstand. She didn't shout. She didn't posture for the cameras. She bled the truth, clean, cold, and undeniable, onto that podium, and it shook the foundations. Clips cycled in. The moment Jasmine read Schumer's past statements aloud, the FOIA documents she held up to the press, the viral silence that followed her final sentence, when even the room's air seemed afraid to move. Each soundbite landed like a hammer striking rusted steel. The panelists were unusually reverent. One, a former Republican strategist, crossed her arms and said, "I've prepped leaders for Senate hearings, state conventions, primetime interviews, and I can tell you, I've never seen someone drop evidence like that and stay so composed. That wasn't just control, that was command." A progressive journalist, normally skeptical of political performances, simply shook his head and whispered, "She didn't read from a script. She was the script." Then they cut to field footage, reactions from America. A steelworker from Youngstown said, "She didn't just come with files, man. She came with fire. She made those suits in D.C. feel like they couldn't hide anymore." A mother in El Paso, "It's the first time I saw someone talk about border policy and actually mean what she said." A 73-year-old veteran from Louisiana, sitting in his modest living room with a flag folded behind glass, held back tears. "She didn't blink, not once. And that's how you know she's real." Back in the studio, the tone hardened with admiration. The host pointed to a live heat map of trending Twitter topics. Crockett truth is still climbing. She's outpacing every other sitting member of Congress in mentions, across all major platforms. Then pausing for emphasis, she added, "And it's not because she yelled louder. It's because she had the receipts and the resolve. The data didn't lie." In just 4 days, clips of Jasmine's press conference had accumulated 47 million views on TikTok, 23 million on YouTube, and another 18 million across Facebook, Instagram, and X. Influencers from both the left and right reposted segments not for clout, but because, as one ex-Marine put it, "I'd rather follow someone with truth than someone with seniority." The camera then zoomed on Jasmine's final line from the hearing, printed across the screen in bold white letters. "The truth doesn't need a party to stand. It just needs someone brave enough to carry it." From that point forward, the show shifted from recap to reckoning. The anchor looked directly into the audience and delivered what viewers would later call the Crockett Doctrine. "We have for too long mistaken power for wisdom, experience for empathy, and comfort for justice." But this week, a woman most pundits had written off as too loud, too young, too radical, rewrote every one of those assumptions. Behind her, graphics changed to major headlines. Fox News, Schumer unmasked by Crockett. CNN, document trail raises tough questions for Senate leader MSNBC. Reckoning within Democratic Party, The Washington Post, Crockett's receipts spark internal revolt. The Atlantic, the conscience of a new generation. As these titles appeared, so did the real-time reactions of voters. One young woman in a Baltimore cafe shouted, "Yes!" at the screen. A trucker parked along a 70 posted a selfie captioned, "I don't always agree with her, but damn if she didn't just clean the whole house." Even a retired judge from Georgia took to LinkedIn to write, "Jasmine Crockett reminded us that truth is not a performance. It's a responsibility." The CNN host closed the segment with words now immortalized in editorials and op-eds. This wasn't politics. This was a mirror held up to the Capitol, and what it reflected was not flattering to the establishment. But it was honest. Jasmine Crockett didn't ask for permission. She didn't ask for applause. And she sure as hell didn't ask for protection. She walked in with facts, and she walked out with the conscience of the country following her. Then came the final statement, the one that would be screen printed, quoted, and inscribed in high school classrooms from California to Pennsylvania. Not age, not party, but truth and courage defined the Jasmine Crockett moment. The show faded out, but the aftermath didn't. Within hours, CNN's website crashed under the load of video replays. Civic groups updated their invites. Former critics posted reluctant admiration. And in Capitol Hill offices across party lines, aides had one shared thought: this is going to change everything. The Sunday shows rewrote their rundowns to include her name in every segment. By Monday, she'd received 47 interview requests from outlets that had never returned her calls. Students quoted her in debate class. Activists stitched her words onto banners. A small-town newspaper in Nebraska ran the headline, "Crockett teaches the Capitol how to listen." It wasn't about fame. It wasn't a viral moment manufactured for applause. It was a shift, a reorientation of the moral compass in a chamber long adrift. And all of it, every syllable, every breath, every tremor, began with one woman refusing to blink in the face of an empire built to outlast her. But maybe that's exactly why she couldn't be ignored. And yet, as the headlines burned through the airwaves and millions echoed her name, it wasn't the viral metrics or thunderous applause that defined the moment. It was the silence that came after. That deep, resonant silence when America paused just long enough to ask itself, what have we become? And who have we ignored along the way? For Jasmine Crockett, this was never about glory. It was about visibility, the kind that can't be borrowed or staged, the kind you earn by standing when others shrink, by speaking when it's easier to echo. As she walked alone from the Capitol that evening, still gripping the folder she'd weaponized with truth, the streetlights flickered like the last remnants of doubt clearing from a storm. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate, because she knew this wasn't a victory, it was a reckoning. The lesson America learned that day wasn't about one politician's hypocrisy. It was about a structure so desperate to maintain its illusions that it feared its own reflection. Jasmine didn't just reveal duplicity, she exposed the rot hiding behind carefully worded statements, bipartisan shrugs, and polite gaslighting. She tore down the curtain and forced the room to stare at its own shame. And that took something more dangerous than intellect. It took integrity. She didn't come from wealth. She didn't have family connections spanning through DC hallways. What she had, what no system could discredit, was lived truth. Generations of it. The exhaustion in her mother's knees, the resilience in her grandfather's back, the quiet fury of her community, who'd been told for decades that nuance was only a privilege for those who'd already won. Jasmine carried them all into that room, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for clarity. And when clarity came, it didn't shout, it echoed. That's the human lesson buried beneath the headlines and viral reels. That courage isn't noise, it's endurance. That character doesn't come from rising polls. It comes from standing in front of a room full of liars and not flinching when one of them smirks. It comes from being called a recording by a man who's written more flip-flops than laws, and choosing not to scream back, but instead pull out the receipts. It's understanding that silence is power when you've earned the right to break it. And still, Jasmine knew the applause wouldn't last. They would try to claw it back, reshape the narrative, frame her as divisive, say she made things personal. But she also knew truth, once spoken, doesn't go back in the box. It doesn't apologize for its volume. It doesn't fade for comfort. The moral wasn't just for the politicians. It was for the people, for the viewers sitting in living rooms across forgotten counties, for the janitor who's never seen anyone in Congress who looked like him hold a nation still with facts, for the girl in the South Side classroom who, for the first time, Googled the name of a representative, not to mock, but to memorize. What Jasmine Crockett taught the country wasn't how to win a fight. It was how to stand in one. She reminded us that political courage isn't measured in filibusters or fundraising rounds. It's measured in the nights you don't sleep because you're cross-referencing documents alone, knowing no one will thank you. It's when you walk into a press room knowing the jokes are already written, but you walk in anyway, prepared not with slogans, but with truth heavy enough to sink a career if dropped right. She showed that representation isn't